Hello, everyone. It's Maya from Trials with Maya Z. I'm very excited because I haven't recorded a new podcast episode for quite some time. But I'm even more excited because maybe 2 years ago, I interviewed an expert in clinical trial transparency, a guy called Theo Brookman. And he absolutely opened my eyes for the need for transparency in clinical trials. And then I recently met Andrew Freeman, who is here with me today. And Andrew, actually, when I started researching about Andrew, I actually realized that Andrew is one of the most popular and experienced people in the UK when it comes to clinical trial transparency. Andrew is behind several initiatives to contribute to clinical trial transparency. So I am, again, repeating the same word, excited, but very, very much excited, really, that I have Andrew here today with me to actually discuss exactly clinical trial transparency, but not only that. Before we dive into some of my questions, and I have many,
Okay.
Andrew, why don't you start with just giving us a little bit of a background of yourself?
Sure. Thanks, May. I'm pleased to be on this podcast with you today. And so I'm obviously Andrew Freeman. I worked at GlaxoSmithKline for many years, a couple of decades and a bit at GlaxoSmithKline, where I latterly was involved in clinical study transparency. I say latterly. I've been involved since about 2005. A meeting at show in Geneva where we identified the 20 or so data elements for study registration. I was at that meeting. So I go back a long way in terms of clinical study transparency. And I led GSK's efforts in that area. So registration, results reporting on registries, and also sharing patient level data from clinical trials. I left GSK a few years ago now and was fortunate enough to get a role at ISRCTN, the UK's clinical study registry, where I chair the board. So I've been doing that since the end of 2022. For a few years now, I've been leading that team at ISRCTN.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll start with your actually achievement at GSK because to me, it is a true achievement. Back in the days, you led the initiative to actually allow patients to get access to their data. Unfortunately, that's still a conversation, ongoing conversation. So I can't say that years later, we've solved this problem. How do patients access their data? Can you tell us more about this project? What led you actually to start
Yeah.
working on that? And what were the main challenges back then?
Yeah. So the initiative was really about sharing patient level data, anonymized patient level data, with other researchers and scientists for them to use that data in further
Mm,
research. It wasn't geared to sharing those patient level data with patients themselves. It was with other
okay.
scientists, but the patients were at the heart of it. And why I say that is that the kind of core was the belief that patients consent to go into clinical trials on the basis that their information will be used to further scientific knowledge and further help future patients. And so a way of meeting that ethical agreement, if you like, with patients is to share the results, obviously, but also share their data with others so that their data can be used to maximum effect in furthering scientific understanding and hopefully medical breakthroughs in the future. So we saw it very much as if you like, completing the circle between patients entering clinical trials and then also sharing their data with other researchers so that all the data that they've provided for that initial clinical trial and then subsequently is used to maximal effect. You asked about kind of lessons learned. I mean, I think the biggest one that I would take away from that experience was if there's a will, there's a way, right? So there are
Mm,
many issues, privacy is an issue, consent's an issue, commercial considerations are an issue. All of those things, absolutely important considerations, but they can all be managed if there's a will to do it and to do it for the right reasons. So it's very easy sometimes to have an idea like that and thought, well, it can't be possible because privacy rules. It can't be possible because of X, Y, or Z. My learning was actually there's always a way to achieve it if you have the kind of the goal in mind, and have a great team. I was very lucky to have a great team to implement that with me, and I would also say great GSK leadership
Mm.
to have the vision to do this as an industry leading initiative. So all those things came together. It wasn't absolutely, I won't take all the credit for it. It was a team and the leadership and vision from my leaders at GSK at the time.
Yeah, it's always a team actually that makes a difference. I mean,
Absolutely.
maybe there is a single person that actually is pretty good in communicating the vision and so on and so forth, but there should be a team actually
Yeah, absolutely.
aligned around the mission to overcome all the challenges because, like you said, there are many challenges. Like I said, unfortunately, even today, this is not something that we've solved completely. And it's still a problem that I'm hearing over and over again being repeated and like something that we haven't solved like completely, but it's good that we already have some positive examples. Andrew, I wonder, you mentioned some of the like you mentioned the main like lesson, but I wonder, did this experience in any way inspired you or led you to actually start working on the clinical trial registry?
So, I mean, I guess at the time I was already working on the GSK clinical trial registry. And I think, my long-standing experience in clinical trials registry and transparency, going back, as I said, right back to 2000s, has given me kind of a perspective that clinical study transparency is fundamentally important for the science to progress, but it's also fundamentally important for engendering trust in the clinical research enterprise. And central to that, for me, is making sure that we respect and trust patient contribution to clinical research. And I think the sharing of information, making sure results are out there, is a way of engendering that trust. Now, I think there's a lot we can do in there, particularly in making those results understandable for those who have participated, and indeed understandable for the broader community. Obviously, a lot of results you see out there are geared towards communicating with fellow scientists and fellow researchers in that area, and are very therefore difficult to be able to navigate if you are not an expert in that area, if you are a participant in that study, or if you are just have some interest in that area. They're very difficult to navigate, which is why I think the initiatives around translating that science into more easily understandable formats, plain language summaries, etc., are very important to be able to engage that broader audience and engender trust in the clinical research enterprise. Because without trust, the whole thing falls down, right? You don't get patients participating in clinical research. And if you don't get patients participating in clinical research, you don't get medical breakthroughs. You don't get medical breakthroughs, then we all suffer in the future. To me, it's a continuum, and we must make sure that we respect and trust and respect patients and engender trust in the clinical research enterprise.
No, it makes like perfect sense. You actually mentioned a lot of aspects of the clinical trial like registry, but let's take a step back
Mm,
because I had many guests on my podcast speaking about the clinical trial registries like
yeah.
worldwide, and I think it's fair to start with actually what's wrong with the existing clinical trial registries from your perspective, and what is the main difference you want to bring in the ISRCTN?
So starting with a naked question, what's wrong with them? I guess I'd start with what's right with them.
Okay.
So what's right with them is I think they provide a standardized way to provide transparency of clinical research from the start, prospectively through WHO standards, all trials being registered on a registry, that information being provided on the WHO portal as well. So I think they are very good and provide a great service. In particular, that information on registries can be utilized to enhance recruitment of clinical trials, patients and their carers going into these registries to look for studies that are available. And indeed, ISRCTN has a link through to a portal in the UK called Be Part of Research, which is geared exactly for that, for patients to come along, try and find studies that are relevant for them, or carers coming along to find studies relevant for people under their care, to see if they can find studies. And I think that's really important and part of the registration of studies, um, enabling patients to find studies, but also obviously to create a public record so that studies can be tracked to full publication. So I think registries are fundamentally good before we get into how they can they be enhanced and improved. And I can only really speak to the ISRCTN piece of it because it's the bit I know the most about. And we've done a lot of
Can I
work.
just like
Yeah,
can I interrupt you here actually?
yeah,
Because when I asked you this question, I very much liked what you said, but your lens actually is more coming from the UK infrastructure,
yes,
and I want to like comment on this because um, I've been working with like throughout my work at Find Me Cure and Trial Hub. I've been working with like 76 like different countries, and there are I think on top of my head 17 or 18 publicly available clinical trial registries. And I've been following the clinical like
hmm
trial registries landscape in general. And overall impression is that the UK infrastructure is probably one of the best ones worldwide. And
okay,
everything that you said is actually completely true, but with a caveat in the UK. But outside of the UK, there are very few countries that I'll give you one concrete example. Think of the clinical trial registries as okay, you have one place for overall transparency,
uh
information sharing, and so on and so forth, but you also need another place for the patients. Like,
yeah,
I'll give you an example in the States. I mean, there are many websites, don't get me wrong, many providers, also businesses that help you be part of research, advertisement on the TV and whatnot. However, city.gov, no matter the enhancements, is still not a place for for patients and caregivers to go there and really
yeah,
be supported. I still remember, like, I don't know, 12 years ago when I was searching for clinical trials for my sister, how difficult it was to
yes,
understand the information. And even after the revamp, one critical thing that I still see like happening there is like, who do you contact? I mean, okay, I
yes,
see something. I may understand it better. Now AI may help me even further. But then what do I do next? And the
yeah,
call centers haven't been as helpful as I think. So everything that you mentioned is absolutely true in the context of the UK infrastructure. And they're not just the registry. There are many other aspects that the UK government just thinks proactively in doing research more accessible in
yeah,
terms of industry and in terms of like
yeah.
patients. So I want to make sure that I make this caveat. And I
No,
see you want to say something.
I agree. I agree with you. So, my late father, unfortunately, had late stage cancer, and I was looking for a study for him
Sorry to hear
to
that.
participate in. You know, I've got a long history in transparency and clinical trials. Don't worry, Dad, I've got this. I'll go to clinicaltrials.gov and find you a study. I could not find, you know, I'm sure it was there, but I couldn't. It was very difficult. And I supposedly know a little bit about what I'm doing. I could not find a study. It was very difficult to pull out relevant studies, to go through those studies, to find contacts for those studies. And I gave up in the end. I didn't use clinicaltrials.gov. And what I did in the end was use a contact through my network who was an oncologist who put me in touch with a hospital in London that was running a trial, and I got him on a trial that way. But that shouldn't be the way it works, right? It shouldn't be
Yeah,
through personal contact. I was lucky enough to have a contact and was
exactly.
lucky enough to connect my father with a trial in London. But it should be better than that. It should be more engaging than that, which is why I think you're right. The UK's initiative with Be Part of Research for patients to go to a portal which is geared for patients. So it's not the registry. Is a portal. It's using registry information, pulling out certain information from our registry, pulling out in particular our plain language summaries, which we require for registration, and utilizing that in a patient portal. So I think you're right. I think patients coming directly to registries is not ideal, but
Mm,
utilizing that information or key parts of that information for a patient portal, I think
yeah.
is a good way of working. Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Um, let's go back to the ISRCTN. I'm keep reading that name because like the
Yes.
abbreviation is quite big. But when you first started working on this registry, obviously your goal was improving the clinical trial transparency. I wonder, on one side, it'd be awesome to understand how do you understand clinical trial transparency. Uh, so actually, let's go with this one first. What does it mean for you, clinical trial transparency?
Good question. I guess I'd break it down into four elements. So I think it's about registering your study at the start.
Mhm.
to, as we've already discussed, so that there's a public record of your study that can be tracked to publication. I think it's about posting your results on a registry as well. And I think it's about publishing your results in the scientific literature. And I think it's also, as we've already touched on, sharing your patient level data from your study with other researchers. So I would frame it around those four things.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. When you first started the registry,
Mhm.
what were the main challenges at the very beginning?
So, so I was fortunate enough. ISRCTN has got a very long history. It's very
Mm,
well established, well regarded, very good feedback. So it was already a very good registry when I came on board. Um, what we've done since I've come on board is move our focus a little bit to be more UK focused. So the I in ISRCTN stands for international. And absolutely, we're open to all country studies, but we are focused on being the
only UK.
UK's clinical study registry. So we've had that focus, which is part of our strategy. We also were very clear in our strategy that what we want to do is to make it as easy as we can for people and registrants to register their studies with us. We didn't want to make registration in any way kind of a barrier for transparency. Now, there are requirements. I'm not saying it's just press a
Of
button and you're
course.
done. Of course not. But what can we do to make it as easy as possible to register your study, and also as easy as possible to get information out? So what our strategies have been about is about making it easy. What have we done around those strategies? Well, we last year we launched or revised our registration form. So over the years, it has become quite cumbersome. So people have had various good ideas. Why don't we ask for this? Why don't we ask for that? And there are quite a number of fields on that form that were outside the WHO requirements. So we've streamlined that form, focusing on WHO requirements. We've got other fields as well. So mandatory requirement is for a plain language summary, because we fundamentally believe it's important that there is
Yeah.
something there so that patients and others can understand what the study is about. And we've also got, which is important also for patients and others, make sure we've got the center information where patients are being recruited is mandatory
Mm,
as well. Other fields, we're very clear that we've labeled those as being optional. But again, all that is about trying to make it easier for people to register studies. In addition, we're very clear that we're trying to make it as broad as possible. So not just for your interventional clinical trial, but also providing a way for other studies, observational studies, to be able to be registered, because the same transparency principles apply
yeah.
to observational studies as they do to clinical trials. And so we wanted to make sure that we're as broad as possible. So we've done that. And the thing that we've been working very hard on over the last 12 months is a system through which registrants can post their results. So I'm sure
Awesome.
you're aware, last year, May, I think it was, WHO in a Lancet article described what registries should capture in terms of posting results. So we've been working very hard to develop a system through which researchers can systematically post their results. Again, with this, making it as easy as possible as our strategy, where we actually launched our second prototype this week on Tuesday, which is available for people to review and see the direction of travel on that system. So that's another thing that we are doing. But also there's process as well that goes with that. So making sure that we are engaging with registrants, giving them reminders. So making sure, the 12 months from completion is approaching, a reminder for them to post their results, all those kind of things in the background around process, to make sure that transparency principles are adhered to. So there's a lot about the system, but also about process as well, to try and make it as easy as we can for researchers to be transparent. So that's some of the highlights that we've been working on over the last 12, 24 months.
It's awesome what you mentioned about the results. And I also have some questions on the registering of the clinical trial. But before that, I just wanted to share with you, after our preparation call I think like a few weeks ago or like 2 weeks ago, I decided to post a LinkedIn poll, I'm sorry, just to check what do what does my network there, clinical research professions, what do they think in terms of what's the percentage of clinical trials publishing their results? I did some check beforehand what the data says.
Hmm.
Let's say I wanted to see if people have kind of accurate expectations. So it turns out that people are more pessimists. So it turns out that 64% of the voters voted for below 25% of clinical trials post their results after they're completed.
Hmm.
And only 24% said that just about 50%. And actually, I checked several articles on the topic. Depends on the country, but
Hmm.
around 40 to 50% of clinical trials
Hmm.
post their results. These are the official, let's say,
Yeah.
numbers. So it looks like that people don't trust that. And these are people from the clinical research industry, like most of them. They don't trust that clinical trials results will be published. So I hope that will change this trend. And hopefully, with this registry and other registries pushing towards results
Yeah.
publishing, we'll see more trust in that because it is important not just for industry
Yeah.
for the patients themselves, but also for all these people working in this industry. Many of them joined the industry exactly because they think that they're contributing to something like for
Yeah.
better, for our future, for medicine, for people's health. And so knowing that there is a collaboration and transparency is very much like key. Going back to what you mentioned about registering the clinical trials, I wonder because clinical trials are done by various types of institutions. Some of them private, like the
Mhm.
businesses, pharma, biotech companies, like CROs, others, academia sponsored, governmentally sponsored as well. I wonder, where do you see the biggest resistance when it comes to willing to register their clinical trials and share more information about their clinical trials?
So yeah, it's a good question. But I think before I go into that, you mentioned kind of some of the percentages
Yeah.
around um, transparency, and you may be aware the HRA recently published the metrics for UK clinical studies, I think from 2024. Um, and I think they're illuminating a number of ways. So the
Okay.
number of studies that were registered, right?
Mm-hmm.
94% were initially registered, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, great, well, let's move on. But let's pause a little bit. So it's 94% of around about 1,300 studies. So that means around about 80 studies weren't registered. So that
Weren't registered.
weren't registered, right? So the
Okay.
94% looks really high. You go, well, that's fine. Well, let's move on. But
Yeah.
but hold on. Let's look at that again. Why weren't 80 studies registered? And there were reasons that were provided according to the data to HRA as to why.
Okay.
Okay, but there were some that weren't given reasons. So there again, we're talking about 40, 50 studies where there were no reasons. So I think even in the registration side, where the metric might look good, 94%, there's still quite a number of studies that aren't being transparent, right?
Yeah.
I think that matters.
Of
What are
course.
those studies? Are they phase 3 studies? Are they phase 1 studies? What are those studies? So somebody's doing a study with patients and it's not being transparent. And I don't care whether it's one study
No,
or
absolutely.
it's that we need. So even 94% for me isn't good enough. And I also worry. So what some of the reasons that HRA cite is because the study wasn't considered to be a clinical trial. But why is that a reason not to be transparent? So if it wasn't a clinical trial, so people are looking at the definition of a clinical trial and said, well, actually, my study doesn't fall into the definition of a clinical trial. Therefore, I don't need to be transparent. Yes, you do, right? Just because your study doesn't meet the compliance definition of a clinical trial, you're still doing a study, presumably with patient
With
data,
patients, yeah.
so you should be transparent, right? Yeah, you should absolutely register your study so that
Hmm.
it can be followed through for publication. So we've got a full evidence base, etc., etc. So I think that 94% looks good. Now, yeah, everybody does exams and goes, well, if I got 94%, I'm good. I'm good to go. Actually, let's challenge that. And then looking at the data a bit further, I think it was only around 44% of studies.
42 or 45,
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
I think
Were,
I
were
read that. Yeah.
published. Were published.
Yeah. Yeah, insane.
I mean, that's even worse. What we're talking about, 500, 600 studies weren't
Yeah.
published. So why? What is happening there? I
Mm.
think that's extremely poor, but it's not unsurprising. So if you go back into the UK, I think it was 2018, I could be wrong, there was a House of Commons Select Committee looking at clinical research transparency. And they reported, I think, around about 50% of studies weren't published. So that kind of 50% number hasn't
Yeah.
changed since 2018 to 2024, which is why, of course, there's now regulations in the UK that you must register your study and you must post a summary of the results to the same registry. There's now legislation making you do that, right? Because historically, people doing it voluntarily hasn't worked. Now, you come back to your question.
Can I stop you here, Andrew,
Yep.
before that? Because
Yep.
this is very, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing these stats. I was reading exactly the same, and the regulation that you mentioned is, I think, awesome. Another example that the UK infrastructure getting better and better for both research, but also like patients at the same time. And that's so, so important. I just want to also like pause here and explain why it's so critical for sharing the results to actually change, like the percentage of results that are being shared, for us to
Yep.
change like this percentage, to make it higher. Basically, like a human being, we learn not only from the good lessons, but also from the failures, let's say. So
Absolutely.
even if a clinical trial fails or does not provide the results that we expect, this is still a know-how that everyone else actually can learn from. And
Absolutely.
I recently posted about Alzheimer's disease. There was this publication that became so popular, and everyone started doing research exactly following these new trends. Let's put it like that way. They put not only efforts but huge amount of funding into that particular area, and nobody really shared that this is not going in the right direction. And so more and more companies and people are going after this trend until one moment of time, years and years later, realizing, oh, we're actually in a, yeah, that's a dead end.
Yeah.
And that's not the right direction. So
Yeah.
that's why it's so critical for the results to actually be published, because no matter what happened, no matter the results, they are critical know-how for the entire humanity and for the future of medicine at the end of
Yeah,
the day.
absolutely. And if you talk about medicines, it means that potentially there's not a complete evidence base around that medicine. Like some of it isn't being published, and that leads to obviously publication bias and decisions being made on an incomplete evidence base, which is fundamentally wrong. Okay,
Yeah,
so I think that's really important, and it also, if it's not published, then other researchers may duplicate the same research,
exactly.
wasted resources, but also put patients at risk unnecessarily, right? Because they're being recruited into a study that needn't have taken place. So there's loads of reasons why results should be published. But the kind of the challenge is multidimensional, right? So again, when I was looking at studies for my father a few years ago, and trying to access results of studies. So only half of them are published, but those that are published, trying to access the results of those. Um, and having worked in GSK, and you used to go online, the library app on your desktop, click that, read the paper, not a problem. But of course, now I'm not at GSK, and you click on a link to read a paper. Oh, I need to pay £70 or £80 to read that paper, right? They're sitting behind a paywall. So not only is only
Hmm.
50% published, a certain proportion, I don't know how many, sit behind a paywall. So I'm not going to pay £80 every time I want to read a paper. And then when you get there, how many of those them are understandable to a general audience, right? So if you take that funnel, at the end of the day, the number where they've got results that are available and understandable is probably quite small. And I think that's where this trusting comes in that I referred to earlier. If through all of that research, only a small percentage is actually understandable, I think that undermines trust of the whole clinical research enterprise. And I think as a community, we should try and fix that as much as we can.
Yeah. Going back to my original
Yes,
question,
sorry.
where do you see the biggest resistance?
So this is kind of another kind of challenge. The new regulation relates to clinical trials of investigational medicines called CTIMs. Okay. And clinical trial investigational medicines, a lot of those are done by industry. With an industry background, I know that with a regulation, industry will make sure they're compliant. It's just what industry does. They're very heavily regulated industry, and they make sure they comply with the regulations. So I have every confidence that industry doing CTIMs will comply. I think it might be more of a challenge sometimes for academic institutions because they don't have that infrastructure that industry's got. Industry's got, compliance functions, policy functions. They've got policy and process. They've got, things to check to make sure it's being done. Risk report. Yeah, the whole gambit
Yeah.
of tools and resources to make sure that regulations are complied with. I think maybe, I don't know, I've not got a history in academia, but that infrastructure may not be as robust in some academic institutions. I think the other challenge is, which relates to my point about looking at whether it's a clinical trial or not, is that the regulation relates to CTIMs. I think there's a risk that people will look at that and go, well, actually, my study is a clinical trial, but it's not a clinical trial of an investigational medicine, not a CTIM. Therefore, I don't need to be transparent. And I would argue, yes, you do, right? Just because it's not within the regulation and it's not, within the definition of a clinical trial of investigation of a medicinal product, you should still be transparent for the reasons that we've mentioned. So there is a kind of a danger that it's a compliance mindset that's applied. Let's look at what the regulation says, let's comply, versus a transparency mindset, which says, I'm doing research with patients, whether it's a clinical trial, observational study. I need to be transparent with this. I need to make sure it's registered. I need to make sure the results are posted. I need to make sure it's published. And I would argue I need to make sure the patient level data is shared for other researchers. It doesn't matter whether it's, outside the detail of the definition within a regulation. You should be doing it anyway. And so I think the danger that people will go, oh, it's not a CTIM, it doesn't apply. But kind of the ethics of it do apply. And I would encourage people to do that.
Yeah, but you're touching on something like something very sensitive. Whether everyone will do what's right, basically, and whether society is built on what's right or what's forbidden, or what should be yeah, you get what I'm saying. And this is actually the question: if we know, and if regulators know that companies will follow what the compliance is, why wouldn't they change the regulations so that it captures all the clinical trials? In my episode with Till Brookman mentioned an idea that I very much like. Don't get me wrong, I didn't go into details. Maybe there are some caveats that needs to be considered. But for example, he mentioned that probably, let's say, academia that gets funding for doing some sort of a research, why not actually being allowed to get a certain part of the funding only after publishing the results? Or you get funding for the next research only if you've published the results beforehand, for example. So I know that this is more like carrots or the stick type of situation. However, if we have such a horrible situation with less than 50% of clinical trials providing transparency and sharing their results, and by the way, it's not just the result sharing. It's also sharing things like where the locations of these clinical trials are. I mean, I know firsthand that there is a lot of resistance in sharing this information as well. So my point is that if compliance is the driving force, why wouldn't regulation actually captures all of this clinical trials and make it mandatory for all of these people?
Yeah, good challenge. I think the problem with regulation is that it's very difficult for it to evolve and develop, right? If it's voluntary and there's not a hard and fast regulation, it can evolve and develop over time. So, in the United States, obviously they've got a regulation around registration and results posting, which is very strict in terms of what it is you will post. Which is great on one side because it means that everybody has to do exactly that. The downside is that maybe there are things in there that shouldn't be there, or things that should be there instead. But then it becomes very difficult to change and adapt it because then you have to go through the legislative process to get it changed, or at least the guidance process. So there are upsides and downsides. I just think that if you have the right mindset, the transparency mindset that I've referred to, which is right for patients, it's right for science, it's right for evidence base. And I think people who do clinical research, I think they have these core values anyway. And I just think it's just about trying to make it, as I started in our ISRCTN strategy, making it easy, right? If it's difficult, it won't be done. If it's hard,
Sure.
it won't be done. So what can we do to make it easy? So again, we've got links from health research authority systems into ISRCTN, so people don't have to key in the same information. I know you say, well, that's a small thing, but I think these little small things can all add up, such that it becomes actually quite a straightforward thing to be able to be transparent with your study. And I just think you're right. There are things that you can do around funders can say, well, we're not going to fund your next piece of research unless we've seen a publication. I've been in meetings where funders have said that is their policy. I don't know whether they're not following through with that. I have no idea.
Mm,
I think from my standpoint, I'm looking at this and saying, well, what can we do? What
yeah,
can
of
we do
course.
as a registry to try and address our piece of the world,
Mhm.
if you like? And that comes back to try and making it as easy as we can for people to register with process, reminders, and systems that help rather than hinder. And I'm sure we won't get it right all of the time. I'm sure that, we need to develop our systems, that our results system is very, very complex in many ways because there are so many results fields. It's far more difficult to design something that captures results versus just capturing a protocol summary. And I'm sure we need to develop and evolve that, but we want to work in partnership and then collaboratively with the research community such that they can be transparent and we can provide information that makes sense and is understandable. And I think there's a lot of shared objectives in that space that we can build upon.
Andrew, I wonder, I completely agree with you that only like relying on regulations will not like do the job, or it will do probably it will take way more time, way more mistakes, and so on and so forth. And we need to do something towards making it easier. And so the people with a transparency mindset, I just love this transparency mindset, like as a word. This is the thing that I'm gonna take away from this episode,
Okay.
definitely. So let's say that the people with the transparency mindset, they will have one more, let's say one less excuse for not for why they should actually register both their clinical trials results and everything else, basically. So that's really important. You mentioned that it still takes time, even with all your efforts to make it easy and so on and so forth. It still takes time. It's still not like completely effortless. I wonder, have you considered the whole world is speaking about AI agents and
Yes.
whatnot? So is that a topic now that you're building your features and capabilities of the registry?
It's certainly a topic that we've started to discuss and explore. Obviously, we've got our focus at the moment is around results disclosure, but certainly there are huge opportunities, I believe, with utilizing AI
Hmm.
technology. So, for example, an AI technology could utilize what we have on ISRCTN as as its information source, and you could ask a plain language question: is there a study near me in Manchester looking at whatever condition I've got? The AI can probably provide that answer in a more patient friendly manner than trying to search through our keyword search
Yeah.
and that way of thing. So I think there's huge opportunities there. The kind of challenge is that it's kind of not always 100% correct, and it can make things up, hallucinate, or not get things absolutely right. But I think there's huge opportunity to use those technologies. I mean, even today, I've got a question that I need to have answered. What is the WHO requirement for X? I'll go on to ChatGPT or Claude, find the answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't go to the WHO website anymore. I go to Claude or ChatGPT, and the answer's there, and it's with context. And most of the time, in my experience, it's pretty accurate, and they're getting better and better and better. So absolutely, I think AI absolutely is a huge advantage and an opportunity, a tool to help engage the broader community in clinical research, whether that be patients, carers, or indeed the broader public, right? So I'm always amazed, that there are, land-breaking landmark studies in Nature and other scientific journals, but the public doesn't necessarily get to hear about them unless it's picked up by a particular journalist, and it may not
Of
be
course.
reported that well. But I think there's lots of great science going on, and I think I've always thought that if it only be communicated in a way that's more engaging, more understandable to a general audience, you'd get more engagement in science generally, whether that's clinical research or basic science. So I think AI can help unlock that kind of
Yeah.
key, if you like, or be a key to unlock that.
No, I agree.
And
But for our audience, it's also important that actually your work, like to mention that your work on the clinical trial registry, transparency side of things becomes even more important because many people say dirty data in, dirty data out,
yeah,
basically, dirty insights out. I'm also using the chat GPTs and Claude and so on and so forth. I generally rely on the information there, but I also have to say that I had cases where I've been very much misled.
yes,
Actually, it was recent with a very serious miscommunication brought to a governmental website, which actually turned out not to be a governmental website. So
yeah,
yeah, I had some challenges with that. But my point is that that's why it's even more critical now to work on these registries, to have the right data, complete data, up-to-date data, because if that's not the case, no matter what type of AI layer you put onto your platform, or let's say, or you just using, let's say, Claude or ChatGPT, you will be misled and will maybe be even more challenged with
yeah. That's the downside.
awareness and the reliability.
Yeah, but that's the downside. The upside is, I think as you're probably aware, it is quite hard to write up your study in a way that's generally understandable for an audience. It is
True.
a hard, and
Yeah.
particularly if researchers and scientists who are not used to doing that kind of communication are trying to do that. It is a hard thing to do. It's not easy at all. And I just think if you've got some data or a scientific paper and put it into ChatGPT or Claude and say, make this understandable, it gives you a huge start. Absolutely, you have to check it. Absolutely, you need to
Yeah.
develop it. But it gives you a huge start rather than you're looking at a
Oh,
blank screen
absolutely.
and the cursor, flicking at you. You're thinking, how on earth am I going to do this? So I do think they are. You're right. You need to use them in the right way, but I think they, used in the right way, are a huge advantageous tool. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I can continue speaking with you forever. However, we're out of time. So I have one last question
Okay.
to wrap up and summarize your perspective on the topic. If there is one thing you could change about the industry's perspective on clinical trial transparency, and not just perspective, but the whole industry's approach towards clinical trial transparency, what would that be?
Do you mean the pharmaceutical industry?
Um, in general, like clinical research industry, not just pharmaceutical, but also like academia, everyone
It's
that's involved
it's
in it.
it's a bit of a cliche, I'm afraid, but it is focused on the patient, because if you focus on the patient around what the
Mm,
patient wants and needs, both into the trial and outside the trial, transparency will flow from that, right?
it's no
So
brainer.
I know the focus on the patient is kind of a bit of a cliche. Everybody will raise their eyebrows, but actually, if you do that, you won't go far wrong. And if you have that focus with that transparency mindset that we've got, you'll get, I think the world will be a better place, hopefully, in terms of clinical research transparency anyway.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. My final words for the audience is make sure that we all have the transparency mindset, like Andrew said. At the end of the day, we're doing it also for ourselves, because if there is no transparency, there is no trust in clinical research, and there is no progress in clinical research in medicine. So we all need the transparency mindset. Thank you,
And
Andrew, once again.